Hello there, this is James Oscroft, EUJames1978, with a brief addendum to part 2 of this video series, links down in the underbar, because having mentioned creationism in that video, there's one point that I still feel compelled to address, but which simply didn't fit into that script. Namely, the fact that although I adore the Reacteria series by Forrest Valkai, also links down in the underbar, I was a huge fan of Holy Hallucinations back in the day, and I basically cut my YouTube teeth on the OG atheist community, the defining problem faced by all creationist debunking channels, and the reason why I gave up talking about creationism at least 10 years ago now, is that creationists only ever have one argument, just as conservatives infamously only ever have one joke. That even though he's only made 18 videos reacting to creationist propaganda here on YouTube at the time of me recording this, Forrest Valkai has already become visibly disheartened by the fact that creationists are all merely recycling this single argument, and there is little to no educational value in debunking the same lies over and over again. So in his latest Reacteria video, he's merely pwned a terrible creationist propaganda movie for giggles. But just as I still feel compelled to explain that we're all motivated by the existential fear of not being special or superior anymore throughout this video series, even knowing that the people who most need to hear this will never actually listen, I also feel compelled to explain the creationist single argument in the hopes that someone somewhere will benefit from this knowledge eventually. So in a nutshell then, every single work of creationist propaganda is always either declaring or at the very least taking as read that A, evolutionism, in inverted commas, is merely a religious belief as well, but B, unlike rational and common sense creationism, it's an irrational and absurd religious belief because life, the universe and everything are all far too complex to have merely come about by random chance. So therefore C, creationism wins because creationists believe in an omnipotent God, while evolutionists believe in miracles without a miracle worker. This is the be-all and end-all of the entire creationist notion, to use the term preferred by Jeffrey P. Moran in his book American Genesis, because calling it a movement is far too narrow and restrictive, and even when creationists are focused solely on a single aspect of this narrative, the argument that they're presenting, or at the very least implying, is always exactly the same. For example, when Ken Ham takes pains to distinguish between historical science and observational science, his sole aim, goal, and purpose is to reinforce the lie that evolutionism, is merely a religious belief, no different from creationism, that the conflict between Christo-Fascists and the entire field of science is merely a difference of opinion based on differing interpretations of the same evidence because we can't know what happened if we didn't actually see it happening, and ultimately this infantile demand of "were you there" is the linchpin, bedrock and keystone of the entire creationist notion, the reason why they can simply declare that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, Lucy was just an ape, and that all of the species which supposedly prove that humans evolved from and still are apes are either humans or apes, that each is a part of its own distinct created kind, that any speciation we see is merely pre-programmed changes and adaptation within the hashtag kinds, and that their twisted interpretation of Genesis 1 is as good as the evidence produced by the entire field of paleoanthropology, because unless and until we see a chimp giving birth to a human, then it's all still hashtag just a theory. In short, they can no longer deny the scientific evidence like their spiritual ancestors who, as little as half a century ago, genuinely believed that dinosaur bones were planted by Satan to deceive us into not believing in God, so now they have to pretend that if we can't actually see it happening in real time, then it isn't real science, and any declaration of what might have happened a million, a billion, or 14 billion years ago is merely an assertion based on faith, or as Forrest Valkai put it himself, historical science is anything which they can bullshit down to their level, while observational science is anything they cannot. Likewise, all intelligent design malarkey, the watchmaker argument, the creationist cry that mutations can never create new information and only ever cause diseases and deformities, along with the precision of the fine-tuning of the forces required to have allowed the Big Bang to occur, are all just 257 million different ways of saying that it's all far too complex to have ever happened without the divine intervention of my God. And even something as apparently unrelated as the straw man that science always changes but the word of God never does, condemning the fact that science is always updating itself and correcting past mistakes, exists merely to reinforce the lie that evolutionism, is an absurd and irrational religious belief because it's always changing its mind, so only the Bible can ever be trusted. But therein, though, lies the irony, because creationist lies and propaganda have evolved, beyond all recognition over the course of the last 100 years or so, in the face of the ever-increasing mountain of scientific evidence against them, so now even the Bible doesn't agree with them, and neither do the overwhelming majority of Christians as they twist themselves into mental pretzels, insisting that they agree with the science, but evolutionism isn't science, even going so far as to accept all of the mechanisms of evolution, such as natural selection and mutation, and even that microevolution happens, but still refusing to admit that all of these realities add up to prove what they mockingly describe as microbe to man or fish to philosopher evolution, constantly moving the goalposts and declaring that even though it's obviously changed, it still isn't enough change. However, the most vital thing to understand here is that even if we could produce a crocoduck, they would simply move the goalposts again, and while creationist propaganda convinces almost no one and is produced solely to help maintain the isolation and self-righteous persecution and martyr complexes of the people who already believe this bullshit, fascists don't even need to try to convince any one of these lies at all, because no different from racism, homophobia, transphobia, or any other field in which they twist a middle school level understanding of science to legitimize and rationalize their own bigotry, it's got nothing to do with the science or with religion for that matter, only with the existential dread that they feel in the face of social evolution, specifically the fact that they're not the sole arbiters of what is right or natural anymore, and the people who they demand the right to exclude and oppress are demanding to be included and treated as equals. And as I'll explain next in part 3 of this video series, even the most self-proclaimed progressive leftist activists on the planet who've never regarded creationism as anything more than a joke or a punching bag will allow the fascists to seize power and impose a tyranny upon all of us merely because the degenerate inferiors got a little too uppity and made them feel icky inside.